Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. In this podcast, I'm going to address the issue of national borders. I think it's a very important topic, especially given the world that we are living in. The fact that right now, for example, Palestine has successfully been able to propose to the UN Security Council becoming an independent nation. But we all know that will not happen since the US has already signaled, as if we needed a signal from the US, that it will veto that resolution. To me, that makes the US even more evil than it was before. It makes me hate my own country even more than I hated it before. Given the tragedy that Gaza is being subjected to on a daily basis, for the United States to prevent Palestine from becoming an independent country with its own borders to control, to me seems like a totally unforgivable act. And it is one that I can never and will never, in principle, forgive the United States for doing. Of course, it has done it many times in the past. But to my recollection, this is the first time that the US will do it right in the middle of a genocide, right in the middle, right now, of the Holocaust of the 21st century by Israel. If there was ever a time when Palestine needed its own borders, it is now. And yet it won't happen because of the way in which the UN is organized and because the power that was given to a few nations to veto resolutions, but not to all. And why was that power given? Well, because if that power were not given to them, we would not have a UN. The UN, pardon me, the UN would have gone down the same course that the League of Nations did before it, meaning there never was a League of Nations. I mean, there was on paper, and really the League of Nations was actually proposed by the US. But for whatever reason, the US decided not to support it. And so it went down in flames. The same did not happen with the UN. But I think that's because the US and other countries like the former Soviet Union were treated with special gloves. In other words, they and a few other countries were given the right to appeal resolutions, while the majority of other members of the UN did not have that right. If I were the head of a country, would I join the UN under the present circumstances? As an act of protest? Certainly not. And I would make my views widely heard and widely known. I would say the reason I am not joining the UN is because of the veto power that only a few nations have, but that my nation will not. And so I might put forward a resolution, and the US, Russia, whatever, might decide to veto it, and thus my resolution would not even get its day in court, meaning it would not even be able to be voted on, or the voting would be meaningless because the US or the USSR, or now Russia, or some other country with that power would take that resolution away from me. To me, that is theft. That is theft. And to join the UN under those circumstances would be completely objectionable to me. And as an act of righteous indignation, I would refuse to join the UN unless it modified that policy, which of course it never would. Because if that policy were modified, the US, Russia, and other countries would most likely leave the UN. And so that would be the end of it. And thus the UN would effectively be a meaningless, powerless organization with no ability to implement its wishes in any area. So, what has happened? Palestine, once again, proposed to become an independent, sovereign nation with the ability to control its own borders. Obviously, that is not something that Israel would ever tolerate. Now, Israel is not even one of the countries that has the veto power, but the US, as its godfather or godmother, I suppose, as its protector, has said, no, we will not allow it. And if this resolution comes before us, we will simply veto it. And that will be the end of the story. Palestine will not become an independent state because, in the view of the US, whether Palestine becomes an independent state is a matter to be negotiated between Palestine and Israel. Israel, the country that is now destroying Gaza and would destroy Gaza completely were it not for at least some objection by the international community. Israel, which is the major enemy of Palestine and has been since its founding, even before its founding, but especially since its founding in 1948. But it doesn't matter. Israel and Palestine are essentially one. In fact, Israel might as well be the 51st state, or perhaps you could say that the United States might as well be a part of Israel. It simply doesn't matter. Functionally, politically, the two countries more or less function as a single unit. There are occasional disagreements, like there is now. The US would rather that Israel does not retaliate for the retaliation by Iran, but Israel says it's going to do it anyway. So again, it doesn't matter. The US can say something, Israel can do it or not do it, but still the US is there to protect Israel and to allow a Palestine with its own sovereign borders would, in the view of Israel and the United States, be a threat to the continued existence of the Zionist entity. And what is more desirable, in my view, than the complete elimination of the Zionist entity? I'm not talking about any kind of violent revolution or any kind of violent activities. I would not condone those in one of my podcasts. What I am talking about is a Palestine from the river to the sea, hopefully a secular Palestine that will welcome people of all religions, races, ethnicities, and nationalities. One that will not be exclusively governed by any one ethnic group or racial group and so on. But it doesn't matter what I think. At this moment in history, at a moment when we desperately need a sovereign Palestine with its own borders, with its ability to regulate itself, we're not going to get one. And even though Biden says he opposes what Israel plans to do, which is not entirely clear yet, but it'll involve some type of retaliatory strike on Iran because it committed its own retaliation for Israel's bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. If that makes no sense to you, I will join that club. I know a lot of people that I've discussed this with whom it makes no sense. I'm not even sure if it makes sense to Netanyahu. I don't know. I would not want to get inside that warped man's mind. But whether it makes sense to him is irrelevant. What Netanyahu cares about is power. He is a pure Machiavellian. And if something advances his power, if something furthers the interests of the Zionist entity as he sees them, then he will likely pursue those. If something does not, if something is a threat to him or to the nation of Israel, he will likely oppose that threat with any energy and with any means that he can use. And so tragically, when there should now be a sovereign Palestine right now, this year, this month, there will not be one because the US has said no. And that's all that seems to matter. Justice, fairness, compassion are all subjects which are simply off the table. They don't matter. In our modern geopolitics, all that matters is power and dominance. And I predict, although I don't like making predictions, that the struggle for power and dominance by the first world will, in the not too distant future, cause that world to come crumbling down all around them. What that means, how it will look, whether it will be physical or whether it will simply be a matter of geopolitics, I don't know. But I think that the present situation is unsustainable. A Palestine with its own borders needs to exist. But there is none. There is none. Now, let me contradict what I said for a moment. I just made an argument for borders, Palestinian borders. However, what I would rather see is a world without any borders. If the world itself, by some means, and I have no idea what that means would be, could agree to eliminate its national borders, resulting in maybe something like the EU politically, not economically, because the EU is very much a capitalist body, but politically, if the world could become like the EU, where your next door neighbor literally might live in another country. And I am not exaggerating. It is like that in certain places in the EU. You walk across the street, you pass no checkpoint, and you have walked from one country into another. So what that does is two things. First, it preserves nations and national integrity. It preserves national cultures. But politically, it makes those national cultures distinct from governmental authority, meaning it allows anybody from any country in the European Union to move from one country to another. So a person can live in one country and work in another. A person can go to school in one country, work in another, and live in still another. All of those are right now possible in the EU. And yet, as far as I can tell, there has been no attempt to move the entire world in that direction. Now, if that were to happen, meaning if borders themselves were to be eliminated all over the world, not just say the border between the US and Mexico, because eliminating only a single border would cause crisis. You can't just eliminate one border and keep all the other borders closed. That would be a contradiction. So all the borders would need to be eliminated at the same time, much as what happened with the formation of the European Union. That's what I would like to see. Is it likely to happen right now? No, of course not. Not right now. In the future, we will see. Maybe it will happen in the future. But one of those two things, either give places like Palestine, I would say especially Palestine, its own borders. If we elect to remain in a world of borders, a world of national borders, why isn't Palestine as entitled to those borders as the Zionist entity, or as the US, or Canada, France, or Germany, or Switzerland, and so on? Certainly it is. But because the US basically functions, I'm not sure what the right term would be, but let's just say the godparent of Israel, protecting Israel in any way it can, including by vetoing the majority of resolutions which have been made condemning Israel for engaging, in many cases, in war crimes. The US has protected Israel from that. It is my view that the dialectic is a real power, and that power can work on multiple levels. One of those levels may be something like the Hindu concept of karma minus reincarnation, or the biblical concept of as ye sow, so shall ye reap. So if the US, if Israel are behaving in the ways in which they are behaving, sooner or later, in my view, it will come back to haunt them. You can't constantly contradict the dialectical evolution of the world, which is precisely what the US and Israel are doing, and expect to get away with it indefinitely. Inevitably, there are going to be contradictions built up in that dialectic, which will come back to haunt the countries that have violated those dialectical principles. Going back to the subject of karma. In karma, there is a concept called sanskaras. Sanskaras are like debt, or what happens when you violate karma? What are the consequences of it? So, for instance, I might say that if I believed in karma and I believed in reincarnation, which I do not believe in reincarnation, but say I did, that if I built up a lot of really bad sanskaras in my karma, I might be reincarnated as a cockroach. If I built up a lot of really good sanskaras, I might instead be reincarnated as a prince or a queen. So sanskaras are basically the stuff out of which karma is made and which determines the direction in which karma will take. Likewise, contradictions are the stuff of which the dialectic is made. And the more contradictions that you have in that dialectic, the greater will be the consequences for those who have violated it. And as I see it, the US and Israel, in collaboratively denying Palestine the right to have its own borders, is, whether intentionally or not, and I really can't say which, building up its own contradictions, or if you wish, sanskaras. And sooner or later, those contradictions or sanskaras will come back to haunt us. The dialectic, as I see it, is a real power or force of nature. It is a causal principle, perhaps the most important causal principle that exists in nature. And it is real. It is not imaginary. It is something that works, whether to the benefit of an individual or a collective, or to its detriment. And right now, we are seeing countries like the US and Israel build up contradictions or sanskaras, which I think will eventually work to the detriment, perhaps even in some sense, to the destruction of those nations. And by destruction, I'm not necessarily talking about killing of people. That's not necessarily what I mean. What I mean is the end of those nations, the incorporation of those nations into other nations. So, the contradictions, for example, that Israel is building up in its opposition to Palestinian sovereignty may lead to a world in which there is a Palestine from the river to the sea, and there is no more Israel. Instead, what was Israel becomes incorporated into a greater Palestine, a hopefully secular Palestine, one in which people of all backgrounds, whether Muslims or Jews or Christians or Druzes, doesn't matter, black or white or Asian, can live together under a single canopy. That, I think, is where the dialectic may, obviously I have no way of knowing, but may lead us at some time in the not too distant future. Because the dialectic is powerful. Most people do not believe in it. Most people do not recognize its existence, but it does exist. And whether you recognize it or not, its power is there. And it has the ability to influence us and to make us do what it wants us to do, such as to eliminate Israel and replace it with a larger Palestine from the river to the sea, or to eliminate the US and to incorporate the US into a larger country, perhaps a country that includes Mexico, for example, and countries in Central America as well, and maybe countries in South America too. Whatever. There's no guarantee that anyone has about the future. But I think the one thing that we can take into our minds is the power of the dialectic. And that if we do not respect it, if we do not respect the integrity of Palestine in this time when Gaza is being brutally destroyed by the Zionist entity, there will be consequences to pay, not from you or I necessarily, but from the dialectic. The dialectic in its own way, as a causal principle of nature, has its own means of bringing about the changes that are needed for the survival of humanity. It is a basic principle upon which nature rests. Nature, in fact, I don't think could survive without the dialectic. And so that's basically what I think, that third world especially is the part of the world which is most victimized by borders. For example, right where I live, 2 miles from Mexico, you cross over the border and you are literally in danger of being decapitated just over the border. Is that a problem for me here in Mission, Texas? No, not especially. But when I cross from Mission, Texas into Mexico, or say go over to Reynosa, Mexico, which is not too far away, there I will see what the problem is. I met this guy at a fair about a year and a half ago, and I asked him if he comes from Mexico, and he said yes. So I got into a conversation with him, and I asked him some questions that were not really questions. I just wanted to see what his response would be and how he would elaborate upon them. So the question I asked him was, do you like living in Mexico? His response was, no, it's very, very dangerous. It's true. Mexico is not a safe place to be. When you head even further south into Central America, which is still a part of North America, it gets even worse. The cartels run Mexico. The cartels run Central America. These are drug cartels. They have more power than the governments of the countries in which they reside. And in many cases, the only reason why heads of state can remain in power is because they make payouts to these cartels, as does the military, as does the police. So here in the US, I am relatively safe. The cartels are here, but they don't do anything, at least not that much, because they are here to do a job, to get the drugs as they come through the tunnels, for example, and then to have them transported throughout North America. The last thing they want to do is to be noticed. They don't want to be noticed. But many of them live right here in Mission, where I live. Many of the tunnels go right here into Mission. So I am living in the midst of all these things happening, and yet, do I notice it? No. It feels like I could be living anywhere. There are literally no consequences to my life from living here in Mission, Texas. And yet, if I were to drive just a couple of miles to the south and cross over the bridge into Mexico, a very rural part of Mexico, I might immediately be decapitated or held as a hostage. And if money is not paid for me, I would then be decapitated or killed in some other rather cruel way. So that is what borders do. In the US, we don't really think about borders that much. The US is big. You can drive from one state to another with no border checks because it's all the United States. I can go into Mexico right now and not have to show any identification, not even a driver's license. When I come back into the US, I have to show either my passport or my birth certificate. But even a driver's license would work. But technically, it should be a passport or driver's license. So the borders that exist between the US and Mexico have no real effect on me. They do, however, have an effect on people living in Mexico. And that is why I think that the best solution is simply to eliminate borders entirely. So, two proposals that I've made. The first, well, if we are going to be a world with borders, then Palestine must be a country with borders as well. And to deprive Palestine of those borders is a violation of the dialectic. It is a violation of the moral fiber of the dialectic. The dialectic is not neutral. The dialectic is real. It is a real causal mechanism, and it can act in a way which can either benefit or harm the individual or the group which is interfacing with that dialectic. Second option, eliminate borders entirely, which is actually what I would prefer. Not selectively, not just between the US and Mexico, but eliminate all borders. Again, much as we see in the European Union. That would be, in my opinion, even better, because that would mean that not only do we have a single political unit, but we also have a single economic unit, because I can live in one country and work in another country and go to school in yet another country. All of those things are now possible to people who live in the European Union. They are not possible here in North America. I can't go and do that in Canada or Mexico or Guatemala or any other Central American country. So I am limited in where I can go, where I can work, if I were a student, where I can go to school. Those limitations do not exist in the EU. So again, what I would rather see is something comparable to the EU, but on a broader global level. And that is especially important, in my view, for the impoverished third world, the third world which lives at a standard of living which is unimaginably lower than the standard of living that I have, or that my neighbors have, or that my friends have. People who die of starvation on a daily basis, or people who just barely get by, barely. Now, there are people like that in the US too, but even the poorest person in the US, when you take that person and compare her or him with a poor person in the third world, is not poor at all. So poverty is relative. Poverty is relative. Poverty in the first world and poverty in the third world are entirely different things. And one step, again, which we can take to alleviate that poverty is to create a world without any borders whatsoever. For the time being, this has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.